If we could convene and begin the session. So first of all, I want to deal with first things first. This was originally supposed to be me, Hunter Baker, and Glenn Stanton from Focus on the Family. This is not Glenn Stanton from Focus on the Family.
Sorry to disappoint.
No, it's not a disappointment. This is Dan Darling. So the reason that Glenn is not here is that Glenn had a heart attack right before the conference. Glenn is actually one of the early founding people with Braver Angels. There's kind of that original group, and then there's those of us who joined in some of the very first meetings. And it was my privilege to be in one of those earliest meetings at Eastern Mennonite University with David Blankenhorn and April Lawson and Glenn Stanton and others. But anyway, so Glenn couldn't be here, and I knew that I had asked Dan to come to the conference. I was thrilled that he came. Obviously, he presented yesterday, and he graciously agreed to join me. So I'll kind of introduce myself and maybe introduce Dan as well. My name is Hunter Baker. I'm Dean of Arts and Sciences at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. We are a 200-year-old. We celebrated 200 years this past year. University, we may be like the oldest institution in Southern Baptist life.
I think Union is the oldest continuously Baptist institution.
Right. So in any case, my area of expertise is religion and politics. I have been writing and speaking about those issues for over 20 years now, and have been heavily involved in just kind of the stuff that we're going to talk about. Dan, you have written at least 6 books. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's up to 15 now.
15. Okay. So the bio is not all inclusive.
Right.
Yeah. Dan's Gmail is like Mr. Right. Yeah. And this is the latest. Agents of Grace, How to Bridge Divides and Love as Jesus Loved. So that kind of helps explain why we were able to get Dan to come to the conference. His whole ethos kind of resonates well with Braver Angels. So what we are here to do is to talk about Christian nationalism, okay? And let me just say maybe the most boring thing first, okay? And then I'll kind of get more squarely on the topic. And I feel that in order to talk about Christian nationalism, I have to talk about liberalism, okay? Now, when I say liberalism, I don't mean left-wing politics, okay? I see some people nodding, they understand. When we say liberalism, so one of the members of the board at Braver Angels is Francis Fukuyama, who's a very eminent social scientist in the United States. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama, sort of notably proclaimed the end of history, right? Now, what he didn't mean that history would literally end, but what he was talking about was the idea that liberalism, Western liberalism, which for us, if we're fish, it's the water that we swim in, right? That Western liberalism is like the final political philosophy, right? That so henceforth, the kind of things that we take for granted, such as democracy and human rights, constitutional values like free speech and religious liberty, all of these things will sort of predominate henceforth forevermore, right? These things have become beyond controversy. Now, Fukuyama takes a lot of flack because things have developed in an adverse reaction to that ever since, right? So for example, we really believed that China, once it sort of entered the world economy, that China would become sort of like a lot like the United States, right? Western liberalism would pervade China, and China would have all the same sort of features of life in the United States or maybe the European Union or something like that. We've seen that that's not true, right? That China kind of has its own path that is not necessarily a liberal path in that sense. And likewise, we have seen in the United States, I would say, a breakdown of liberalism. So it is still sort of the dominant philosophy that we have, but we're seeing an increasing development of what we might call illiberal movements or post-liberal movements, okay? So there are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with the liberalism that we have all kind of grown up in and enjoyed, and who are kind of chomping at the bit to go in a different direction. And that's left and right, right? And so on the left, that may take the form of kind of a sort of a renewed interest in communism, or maybe a very heavy interest in woke sort of concepts or neo-Marxist sort of concepts. On the right, it could be like an ethno-nationalism or something like that, or it could be something like a Christian nationalism, right? And when we talk about Christian nationalism, it could be there are sort of Catholic versions of that, and Protestant versions of that. So what Glenn and I really wanted to do, and Dan will help me with, is we wanted to talk about, so what is Christian nationalism? Okay, because there really is such a thing, but also what isn't it? Okay, and so let me give you a little background. There is a very well-known work by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, and they kind of seek to describe Christian nationalism. So let me give you some of the things that they attribute to Christian nationalists, and then I'm gonna take issue with this to some degree. They say that Christian nationalists demand people show respect for national symbols and traditions. Christian nationalists fear and distrust religious minorities such as Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. Christian nationalists condone police violence toward Black Americans and distrust accounts of racial inequality in the court system. They believe racial inequality is due to personal shortcomings of minority groups. They are very uncomfortable with interracial marriage and transracial adoption. They fear refugees. They oppose scientists and science education in schools. They believe men are better suited for all leadership roles, while women are better suited to care for children in the home. They believe the federal government should declare the U.S. is a Christian nation. They believe the success of the United States is part of God's plan, and they believe the federal government should advocate Christian values. Okay, so maybe I'll invite you if you want to reflect on that a little bit, Dan.
Yeah, that's such a broad set of descriptors. There's some things in there that do describe, I would say, Christian nationalism, but there's a lot of things in there that I don't necessarily think would. Respect for national symbols, is something that I think is shared widely across left and right. Some of those other things, like conversations about police brutality, I think are important. I don't know that's necessarily related to the Christian nationalism conversation. I mean, I think at its core, Christian nationalism is a idea of how to structure society, how to structure government. So there's one descriptor in there that I think is accurate, where they want the U.S. government to declare that, United States is a Christian nation or whatever. That would describe Christian nationalism, I think. But some of those other things are shared widely across groups. And it's interesting, I've read that work, as you have. And when they did surveys, they found that the cohort they thought were Christian nationalists necessarily wasn't. It was interesting, the finding. So I mean, I think, as you said, defining what it is important and what it isn't.
Yeah. One thing that really jumped out at me is that Christian nationalists are very uncomfortable with both interracial marriage and transracial adoption. If Christian nationalism is meant to be a synonym for conservative Christians, which I think is how the media typically tends to use the term, I wouldn't think that would be accurate at all. So, for example, I just said that I work at Union University, which is we would be probably a significantly more conservative place than, say, Gettysburg, where we are here, right? And at Union, which is filled with conservative Christians, we have lots of, transracial marriages. People are very enthusiastic about adopting children of all races. You see very many sort of multicolored families within our community. Often people have gone to great personal sacrifice to adopt children from other countries, places where they desperately need somebody to care for them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the adoption question in there was a little weird because Christian conservatives in many ways have been sort of at the forefront of adoption in the last several decades. So that I think that was an interesting descriptor. And I think there is a real serious movement of Christian nationalism, but I don't know that they're describing it by widening the net so far. I think we talked about this before. It's kind of like the word woke, where if woke describes everything, then it describes nothing. And I think that we're Christian nationalist. If it's a pejorative for everything, then it means nothing, right? Conservatives, if you're a conservative who's pro-life, who is a Christian, who wants your country to reflect certain values that you believe, that doesn't make you a Christian nationalist just because you believe that. If you hear the national anthem and you get all the feels at a baseball game and you're proud of your country, I don't think that makes you a Christian national. So widening the net so much like that, I think actually hurts the conversation.
Yeah, I think that what's really going on with a lot of the shorthand of Christian nationalism, and as I say this, okay, I'm going to come back and I'm going to concede that there is a Christian nationalism that is a thing, okay? I'm not talking about that right now. Right now I'm talking about this sort of Whitehead Perry media version of it, right? But one thing that I think about a lot is I think that the people who do this sort of analysis and writing, they are not necessarily seeking to understand the people that they're studying, right? So one of the really great social scientists of the 20th century was a guy named Peter Berger. Brilliant man. But Berger would say that it was really important if you're going to study someone or talk about them, to be able to state their position in a way that they would endorse, right? That if you stated their position, they would then say, yes, that's what I believe, right? I'll stand behind that, right? And a lot of times that does not occur in this sort of media discourse of, Christian nationalism, or sometimes a kind of, white Christian nationalism, something like that. So one of the hallmarks of Braver Angels, and I didn't come up with this term. I remember David was pushing this in the early days. Accurate disagreement, right? So understand, what exactly are you disagreeing with? Let's be clear about that. So part of what I'm seeking to do in sort of unpacking this Christian nationalism narrative is to try to seek to be accurate. Now, is there this kind of package of beliefs that they describe out there? Yes. I'm not sure that I would really attach it that strongly to the Christian church. So for example, Dan and I are both members of the Southern Baptist Church. I assume you're still in the Southern Baptist Church.
Yes.
Yes. We have some friends who are not anymore, but anyway, so I think that we're probably the biggest piece of the Protestant pie in the United States. And I do not experience, I attend, conservative First Baptist Church in Jackson, Tennessee. I do not experience my fellow church members in the way that is really described by this package of beliefs. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're going to get to that. I think there is a movement for Christian nationalism that is, not what that's described. But I think for the most part, evangelical Christians that I've encountered in the churches I've pastored in Illinois and Tennessee, and now we're in Texas, are primarily conservative people. They're pro-life. They care about politics, but they're not as obsessed with it as I think we're made to believe they are. That most of them are just trying to go about their lives like everyone else, get their kids off to school and pay their bills and try to attend church faithfully, do things in their community. And so they don't really describe, I mean, every church has maybe one or two really feverishly political people. I suspect that's the case in all of your congregations as well. But for the most part, they don't describe this kind of person. I do think there is a movement for Christian nationalism more at the academic and scholarly level. We could talk about that, where that sort of conflicts with us as Baptists. Baptists, we talked about this yesterday, but Baptists, if you like liberal democracy and you like pluralism, you could thank in part Baptists because at the founding of the country, it was Baptists saying, hey, we need to not have a state church, but we need to have liberty even for Muslims and Jews. And this was a time when there were very few of those minority faiths. So we can go into what Baptists believe, or we can save that. I don't know.
So I'm going to describe, as we get further into it, I'm going to describe what some of the reactions of Christian nationalism have been from within the church. Yeah. But I just wanted to kind of be clear about this. I think that this package of beliefs is actually not necessarily representative of people in the church. Maybe more describes a certain populist group of Americans. Period. Right. I think that one of the critiques of the survey work they did was that actually are probably a fair number of African American Christians who believe a number of these things. Right. Or Hispanics. Well, not leave off the Christian descriptor. Right. That some significant cross-racial agreement with a number of these things.
Yeah. I mean I think it was, their description is too wide a net. And I think sometimes the popular media description of kind of assigning everything Christian nationalism is unhelpful. And some of the sort of that populism and that the genuine expression of Christian nationalism, a lot of those folks, not all of them, but many of them may not even be churched. They may be in other.
Yeah. So that's another thing, is that the Trump supporter has become conflated with evangelical in the United States, right? And so it's undoubtable that people who are evangelical voted for Trump in large numbers. But just to be descriptive, my suspicion is that the most devout Trump supporters are probably significantly less churched than most evangelicals. So attending church much less frequently than most evangelicals. All right. Now, one thing I want to get into. So why this kind of package of beliefs? This anti-science, anti-minority, all these other kind of beliefs. I think that part of the reason is that it proceeds is that it does diminish evangelicals, right? It is a useful narrative to use in the media. And we like to believe the narratives that are good for our side, right? I'll give you a great example. I'll use myself as an example. How many of you have ever heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn? Okay, so Solzhenitsyn was a great Russian dissident, right? One of the great writers and novelists. His work was really instrumental in helping to bring down the Soviet Union. And so I had once heard, probably promoted by a Christian speaker, I think it was, the idea that when Solzhenitsyn addressed the graduates of Harvard University, that the students booed him, okay? And, I mindlessly repeated that narrative. Yeah, the students booed Alexander Solzhenitsyn at Harvard. Why did I say that? Because I don't like the left-wing secular students of Harvard, right? And they look bad if they booed Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And somebody pointed out to me, there's no evidence that that actually happened. I actually, found a recording. I listened to it. I couldn't find any boos. I was like, wow, I was wrong, right? And I just repeated this because it served my preferred narrative, right? And I think that to some extent this kind of thing happens in the news coverage of certain groups of people in the U.S. Okay, but this is not to say that there's not like a nativism. There's not an Archie Bunker kind of a segment in U.S. population, or that the KKK is not a real thing or anything like that. Okay, now let's move on to talk about the Christian nationalism that really is a thing. Okay, and what that is and how that has developed. And somebody asked me, are we going to get into questions? Yes, I just kind of want to get all the stuff out on the plate here, and then we can have all the questions and conversation that you want to have. And by the way, I just have to add, a couple of my professor colleagues are here in the audience who are also very knowledgeable about a lot of this stuff. So we may get a chance to hear from one of them somewhere in the process. So what is the Christian nationalism that is a thing? Well, the first real awareness that I have of it in the modern period is with a guy named Rousas Rushdoony. Have any of you ever heard of Rushdoony? Okay, I see mainly academics putting up their hands. So the people who know about Rousas Rushdoony are Christian academics and New York Times reporters. So he was I think it was a California Christian figure, and he promoted the idea that the Old Testament law should be put into effect in the United States, that essentially the Old Testament law should be our governing law, right? And if you've read, all of that law that governed Israel, that would be quite a feat, right? To kind of impose that upon the U.S. polity. But that was kind of his movement. There were a group of people who were interested in that and talked about that. It did not get a lot of traction, probably because it was before the internet, before social media, things like that. But so that was a thing. You have anything you want to say about Rushdoony?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had a small group of adherents. Nothing of that was any kind of a majority or anything. But there's always been traces. There's always been some adherence to that. I think in the age of the internet, and just sort of everything that's going on in the last decade, I think there has been a small rise in that people finding each other and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's true with almost everything. However, Rushdoony kind of came and went, always a very marginal figure. But now something is happening. I think it's fair to say. Now, maybe it's because I'm a religion and politics nerd, but I think it's more than a tiny thing right now. And the reason I say that is that the gatherings that I go to, I've been speaking in conferences and in academic settings for a long time now, right? And I am beginning to see an increased reaction to an increased adoption of Christian nationalist sort of ideas. So let me try to talk about that. First of all, some of you may be aware there's a sort of a surprise book that suddenly started selling a lot of copies called The Case for Christian Nationalism. Any of you seen that book? Okay. More people than know about Rushdoony. So The Case for Christian Nationalism, it's funny. So look, I'm a card-carrying conservative Christian, but I had to review that book, and I was carrying it in the airport on recent travels, and I felt like I had contraband. It's like I didn't want people to see the cover of the book. I'm the guy on the plane reading The Case for Christian Nationalism, right? So maybe that's a good indicator for kind of the status of it for a lot of us in the church, right? Is that I kind of felt that it was radioactive as I was reading it. And that was by a young man named Stephen Wolfe. He is a political theory PhD from the Louisiana State University. So not a Christian school or anything like that. And, I'll be honest with you. Some years ago, I told Stephen, he was pushing this line, and I was like, Steve, this is not the way to have an academic career in the United States. If I were you, I would keep my head down. I would get tenure, and then I would start writing what I wanted to write. And he, to his credit, he did not do that. He came out with his first big book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, and he does not have an academic position at this time. But he does have a book that I think has sold very well and gotten a lot of attention and been reviewed in a lot of places. Now, so getting into that takes me into the figure of Douglas Wilson. How many of you have heard of Douglas Wilson? Okay, I see still more hands go up. Douglas Wilson is in Moscow, Idaho. There is a Moscow, Idaho, which is where, I think that's where Idaho State University is, right? Okay, all right. And so they have, Douglas Wilson is basically I would say almost the creator of the classical Christian school movement in the United States, of which there are many by this time. And they are primarily occupied with studying great texts, things like that. And he also founded a college called New St. Andrews in Moscow, Idaho. And the reason I bring this up is that he is a figure who has attracted many people to pay attention to him and what he's doing. I would say that he is probably the most well-known person who would be willing to kind of embrace a Christian nationalist label. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think his press published Stephen Wolfe's book.
That's right. Yes. So if you ever see any books by Canon Press, which is a growing publishing company, CANON, not CANNON, and they are an increasingly successful publisher of materials, and they did publish the book about Christian nationalism. But Wilson, I think, is offering kind of a new center of gravity within evangelical Christianity, I think. So I would say that evangelical Christians previously predominantly and deeply committed to the Western liberalism that I have described, right? And certainly Baptists in a sense are sort of like the co-founders of Western liberalism and the modern Western liberalism. We're very deeply committed to it as well. But as someone who is with undergraduates day in and day out, I have actually even seen students leave Jackson, Tennessee, and move to Moscow, Idaho, because of their great and growing interest in what Doug Wilson and folks out there are doing. In fact, I was teaching a Christian political thought class this past semester, and I showed a video of Stephen Wolfe talking about his book, and half the kids in the class were like, "Yes, right, that is what I'm talking about, right?" And that's a new kind of thing. Do you sense that, or does it seem?
Yeah, I mean, I sense a lot of sympathy toward that. I think some of it is, I don't want to say naivete because that sounds condescending, but I just think.
Well, Andrew Walker called it Dungeons and Dragons for Christians, so it's.
Yeah, and that's a great descriptor. I think there's a few things at the heart of it. I think and I think you see this on the left and the right, and you alluded to this, but I think there's a dissatisfaction with classical liberalism that stems from a couple of things. I think it stems, first of all, from, people seeing the sort of, every system has its flaws, right? And the flaw of classical, the sort of decadence, consumerism, for many, the sort of, in their view, out of control secular revolution and sort of the decadence you see. And they're saying liberalism got us here. It got us to this place. I think the second reason is what Jonah Goldberg says is a lack of gratitude. Because we're situated in this environment, classical liberalism, and we're critiquing the only thing we know, as opposed to experiencing other forms of government, right? Other ways that governments organize themselves, and it's just a lack of gratitude. Because we think, man, this is so terrible. All these things are happening. It's like, well, if you look throughout church history, if you look throughout world history, this is actually the best arrangement that you can see in terms of human flourishing and liberty and all that. So I think it stems from two of those things. It's also kind of this new thing. My critique would be that.
I want you to hold.
Okay, hold the critique. Yeah, right? I have some critiques.
So we're going to get to the critiques.
But I think it's dissatisfaction and ingratitude, really. And I don't share by any stretch, their views of Christian nationalism, but I do understand where the discontent comes from. If it's like if you're parachuted into the United States now without any sense of history, and you look around and see all the problems, you think, man, this is a terrible system. We got to replace it. But if you take the sweep of world history and think, wow, this is the classic liberalism is the best thing going. So,
so the great flaw of liberalism is that none of us gets what we want, right? I mean, the great flaw of liberalism is that it asks all of us to restrain ourselves politically, right? Liberalism says to all of us that none of us are going to try to just like take the whole pie and dominate, right? And impose our beliefs on everyone else. I think that one of the things that frightens me about this kind of oncoming post-liberal movement is that there are more and more people who are saying, no, this liberalism is not satisfying, and that more of us need to be far more ambitious about what we want to try to achieve through politics, right? That we want to basically bring everyone to heel, whether that's left or right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and my contention with that, I have several contentions with it. But from a theological standpoint, Baptists or people who believe in Christians who believe in classical liberalism, we don't believe the government is equipped to make theological decisions. We look at Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares, and it's God who makes those distinctions, not the government. Now as a limited government conservative, I might even say, it's hard enough for the government to run a post office and a healthcare website. Now we're going to empower them to make theological decisions and decide who is good and who's not. And, I think folks like Stephen Wolfe will promise in their prescriptions, if we had a Christian state, we would ensure religious liberty for minority faiths. But if you look throughout human, history, that's never really happened. As a Baptist, I'm nervous about that. Baptists were drowned when other denominations were in charge of the state. So I think from a theological standpoint, we advocate for people bringing their Christian values to the public square and to shape the public square. And actually, we hold two beliefs at the same time. We want religious liberty. We also want, as a Baptist, we want revival. We would like the country to be more Christian, but we think that comes from the from the ground up, from the grassroots. That's something that the Spirit does. That's something that God does. That's not something the government forces on us. So that's the theological critique. The pragmatic critique is.
I couldn't keep him from doing the critiques.
Sorry.
See that, right?
Sorry.
I said we'll hold the critiques.
The pragmatic critique is
Dan's more famous than me, so he's just exerting privilege right now.
Yes. I don't know how you get there. It's hard enough to win elections for your side in a liberal democracy. But now you're going to somehow convince the entire populace to be a conservative Christian state. So, how do you get there? The only way to get there at the end of it is by force, and that's what makes me a little nervous. Now, fortunately, I think it's a small movement on left and right that is dissatisfied with the liberalism, but the end of it is force, right? Lastly, I still think a lot of folks who say they believe Christian nationalism actually rely on arguments from classic liberalism to make their point, right? So if someone who believes in Christian nationalism doesn't get a fair hearing, they're upset. Well, arguing for a fair hearing of your views is a classically liberal idea, right? People who believe in Christian nationalism don't want to be canceled. Well, the idea of not being allowed to be canceled is an idea that comes from classic liberalism. So they're still borrowing from the same.
Well, in the Middle Ages, getting canceled was really serious.
It was. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just run through a few more kind of indicators on this thing, and then we'll open it up to questions. So a few little significant sort of things that have happened. Any of you heard about the Amari-French debate? Okay, a few people heard about that. Sohrab Amari is a Catholic convert. David French is, he now writes for the New York Times. He's sort of an evangelical who criticizes evangelicals these days. But David's a very eminent writer on politics and faith. But Amari, attacked David French. He started talking about David Frenchism, and critiquing French's commitment to American-style liberalism, right? This produced a huge reaction, right? So many pieces were written, so many YouTube videos and things like that, and so that showed the emergence on the Catholic side of things. Amari being Catholic, there is a Catholic Christian nationalism that would go by the name of integralism, right? And so that is something that is also kind of growing and out there. A lot of the work that I have done is with a group called the Acton Institute. And the Acton Institute is predominantly Catholic. I mean, it covers all Christians. But they're very committed to this sort of the classically liberal framework. But I noticed that even last year at Acton, many people felt the need to engage Catholic integralism, right? Now, why do they feel the need in a conference where we never felt the need to talk about it? Why did we have to have 3 or 4 presentations on this topic, critiquing it? Because the pressure is being felt, right? There is something that is building there, right? And on the Protestant side, so we are in the Baptist world, and Dan has accurately stated that Baptists are typically people of this sort of classically liberal view, limiting the state, separation of church and state, religious liberty, all these kind of things. Recently, a Baptist college, Bethlehem College, announced that their president was leaving the college. And the reason he was leaving the college was because he had renounced these Baptistic beliefs. He had decided that he was in favor of the Christianization of the civil order. Okay? And so with that, he left this college. And next thing you know, he has joined Doug Wilson out in Moscow, Idaho, right? Now, Blues, I'm not inviting you to carpet bomb Moscow, Idaho, right? But this is sort of where the movement is beginning to grow. And so, on the Catholic side, if I give you some names, Sohrab Amari, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Chad Pecknold. Okay, I'm going to say maybe two or three more things, then I'm going to turn it over to questions, right? So what do these people believe, right? Number one, are they in favor of the Christianization of the civil order? Yes, generally speaking. So I'm not sure. They would say that they are not theocrats. So by which they mean they don't want the church to rule the society, but they do want the nation to self-consciously declare itself a Christian nation. Okay. So I would say that in the United States for a very long time we have been kind of an unofficially Christian nation, right? But obviously that has diminished some, certainly within the modern period, and this is a reaction to that, right? You know, that they feel that diminishment, that recession of the tide, and there's a reaction against it. And why are they against liberalism? I think that their view is that liberalism forces them to kind of have one hand behind their back, right? And they want to kind of stop doing that and just be, you know, all the way out there in terms of what they're seeking in terms of the government. Now, with regard to race, right? So a lot of the media stuff has kind of pushed this idea that they are ethno-nationalists, okay? And I think that is a complex question. What I mean by that is that I have read the books. They forthrightly disclaim any idea of racial or ethnic superiority. They say that that's anathema to the gospel. You know, all of that. Where it becomes a little more complex is that they do seem to embrace the idea of nationalism, right? And even the idea that human beings will naturally feel more affection for those who are near and dear as opposed to those who are far away, right? Which has led to this discussion of kinism.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think there is a hint of some ethno-nationalism in some of the writings. I think there's either implied or a whispered sort of dislike for the increasing diversity in the country, which is, I think, problematic. They'll often say, not everyone who says this is a Christian nationalist, but you'll hear Christian nationalists say this, that America is not, you know, we like to say, and we've said for most of our history, America is an idea, right? And they'll say, no, America is a people,
right? First.
You know, it's a people. Like every other nation, we're a people, not an idea. And so I think what they're hinting at is, you know, America's always been this sort of melting pot, sort of place where people come from the nations and become Americans. I think there's a push, they would push back on that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, and of course, many of them are very attracted to Viktor Orban, you know, in Hungary. The idea that you can kind of protect the identity of a people, but sort of our view as Baptists would be that can only be a voluntary sort of an affair, right? That you can't you have to be a Christian people, right? You know, so you know, but there is a lot of sympathy for the idea of sort of an officially Christian country or place or identity of a people. Okay, final points, and then I'm going to open it up. What are good responses to this? Okay. First of all, I'd say it's really important to have that ethic of being fair and accurate, right? So I don't think that it's good to be lazy, you know, and seeking every rhetorical advantage in attacking the people who think this way. You know, be clear about what they believe and why they believe it. Engage them honestly. I do think that they should be chastened somewhat by history. Okay, and the reason I say that is that when we a lot of times they will point very happily back to America's founding identity as a Christian identity. Okay, now look, I'm a conservative. I always vote Republican. All these things. I'm a totally sold out Christian. I do not have the romantic view of American history. Okay, the tolerance of slavery is an incredible black mark upon our country. The tolerance of it, the practice of it, the way the Indians were dealt with, also an incredible black mark, and and all of this happened during the time when Christianity was theoretically at its greatest influence, right? That cannot be denied. And so, they need to understand that if you kind of point people back in that direction, there are going to be other people who say, wait, that Christianity was not a panacea for the society in that period. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the idealization of history, and some of them idealize even like the medieval period, right? In sense of like Christians were in charge, and they find the good things from that period and idealize it and don't see the bad things. So I think there's a real danger of that. I do want to say, as much as Christian nationalists can be caricatured, I think the Christian nationalist critique of liberalism is caricature.
Yeah.
Because what they're critiquing in liberalism is not what we actually believe. They are critiquing a sort of atomized, valueless capitalism and sort of naked capitalism without any underlying values. And I think Christians who believe in classical liberalism we don't want that. We're not saying that classical liberalism and freedom is enough to make people virtuous. You also need virtue in a society. We've seen that through history, right? I mean, look at China embraced capitalism, but I would argue didn't have the sort of underlying religious virtue in their society in order to sustain liberty and freedom. So the founders understood this, right? The founders understood, yes, freedom, yes, liberty, but also we need virtue. We need, as I think Russell Kirk says, you need the little platoons of democracy. You need the mediating institutions. You need a healthy church. So if they're critiquing a sort of America that has freedom and liberty and liberalism without virtue and without the institutions that form people, yes, we're against that too. But I think it's a sort of pendulum swing that's unhealthy.
Well, the concern is that liberalism is unstable, right? Yeah. That liberalism itself is at risk, and I think that's right. I actually think so. If I look at this Braver Angels movement, I don't know if any of you would state it this way, but I think that actually Braver Angels is an investment in the protection and preservation of a liberal republic, right? The idea that yes, we do cherish this kind of system of constitutional values, this kind of civic discourse that we have with each other, that we do not want to give in to sort of a war of ideologies, that just constantly kind of tearing us apart, but rather that we want to maintain the importance of those human connections. So all of that. And maybe one more thing I want to say is that I think something that we need to be reminded of is that most of politics, it doesn't feel this way because this is not the way it is in the media, but most of politics is actually a matter of prudence. There is no theological answer to, how many billions or trillions the budget should be, right? There's tremendous room for compromise. Almost any area of policy that we can talk about, there are vast possible areas of compromise that can be explored, and that we should be able to talk about and to reach solutions. I think that as we are tempted to lose hope A lot of times it's because we're focusing on those absolutely most flashpoint kind of issues and ignoring, kind of like an iceberg, the 90% that's underwater and not seen.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll open up with questions unless you want to have a closing.
Yeah, I guess one more thing I wanted to say. I think, as we said in the beginning, it's important to get right our terms. And so there is a critique, as we've said, of Christian nationalism, Catholic integralism, but I think over broadening it, right? So if you're someone who is working and praying for the renewal of society, if you're praying for spiritual renewal, that's not Christian nationalism. If you, throughout our history, our leaders have appealed to kind of a civic religion, civil religion. FDR was famous for appealing to God when he was leading America through World War II. All of our presidents have appealed to that, to the sort of, our documents do that. That's not Christian nationalism. I think that's classical liberalism, understanding that the roots of our freedom and liberty and our ideas about freedom and liberty come from God. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that. That doesn't make you a nationalist. Wanting renewal of our institutions is not nationalism. But there is a kind of nationalism that I think we've critiqued that, I think is unhealthy.
It's funny. Dan and I were talking about this last night, and he said that FDR appealed to God in the Bible more than any other president. And I said, well, it's because he got about 5 more years than any other president ever got. Okay, so with that, let's open for questions. I guess you have the mic. You'll take it around. Okay, why don't we take this gentleman right here?
So real quick, one name that I found was missing in the conversation I was wondering if you'd address is Francis Schaeffer with the Christian Manifesto and How Then Shall We Live? And then something else was just real quick. I feel like I've heard a lot of this language more in the Pentecostal and charismatic, unchurched, traditional movement. So I was wondering what you had to say about that, because it seems like a lot of what you're talking about is more like traditional denominations.
Yeah, so first thing I would say, I do not claim to have tremendous knowledge of the Pentecostal culture out there, so I'm reluctant to address that. But Francis Schaeffer is a hugely important figure. Now, I would not call Francis Schaeffer a Christian nationalist, but he would be a person who is admired by the people who are Christian nationalists, just as I suspect you admire Francis Schaeffer as well. Yeah. Schaeffer is really the guy who turned evangelicals into pro-lifers. When Roe v. Wade happens, we can find prominent Southern Baptist pastors who are like, all right, yeah, totally okay with it. And Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop, any of you recognize the name C. Everett Koop? He was the Surgeon General of the United States, right? Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop during the 1970s started going around to college campuses and showing this film called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that was about the abortion issue. And really, he kind of pricked the consciences of evangelicals on that issue. To me, that's his most lasting legacy. How should we then live? That I'm amazed somebody your age knows about how should we then live, because it's like back from the 70s. I actually, years ago, when you could rent videos, I was in a Christian bookstore, and I went to rent Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and they handed me like 12 cassettes, right? And I stayed up and watched it all night. I had to go to work the next day. I watched it all night. And so for me, what Schaeffer really said was that Christianity is not just something that happens inside a building, right? That Christianity relates to art and to history and to law and to music, just and science, anything that you can think of, Christianity has this relationship to. And so to me, he just kind of taught me to have an open and intellectually curious Christian faith.
Well, and what Schaeffer was responding to in the 20th century was, in some ways, the fruit of the fundamentalist modernist split in the Protestant church, And a lot of evangelicals, a lot of conservative Christians recoiling against a sort of social gospel turned sort of inward and didn't really have a theology that allowed them to help shape their communities and their country. So what Schaeffer was saying to them was not, let's have a Christian state. What he was saying was, hey, this is your country too. You should get involved. You should run for office. You should make arguments. So in a sense, Schaeffer was urging Christians to work within the classically liberal system to change their country, right? And so urging Christians to run for office, urging Christians to express their views, to help change laws and all that, that's not Christian nationalism. That's working within the system, right? So I think we don't want to confuse the two, right? But I'm glad you brought up Schaeffer, and I think he was very influential.
And something else. So, Dan shared with me last night that he grew up in a fundamentalist family.
Yes.
And the fundamentalist posture for a long time was isolation, separate, right? So Schaeffer is one of the guys who kind of reached out. Another one was Carl F.H. Henry. The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism.
That's right.
Very famous book. There's a picture of me holding my daughter as an infant, and I'm reading that book in my other hand, because I was trying to finish my doctorate. Okay, now we had a lady here. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, thank you. First, thank you very much for both of you incredible presentation, very, very well informed.
Thank you.
So my introduction to Christian nationalism, I live 10 minutes from the U.S. Capitol, was December 2020, and I heard Congresswoman Lauren Boebert from Colorado saying that, quote, Jesus will make sure that Trump is president. It wasn't in the newspaper. I heard it with my own ears. So that was kind of my introduction, which I thought as a Jewish person was very, very frightening, really frightening. So I'm taking my definition of Christian nationalism from Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I don't know if you've heard of
I read that
group.
Yeah.
And they said, and kind of what you both said, that it's the idea of merging Christianity with being an American, just merging the two identities. And so my question is, do you think that Christian nationalists understand why American Jews think that Christian nationalism would turn them into second-class citizens? Because many of us, many American Jews, think that the abortion issue and overturning Roe v. Wade is an imposition of conservative Christian values on Jews and other minorities, including some Christians, public prayer in the schools, denial of LGBT rights based on Christianity, not just denial, and why so many of us are terrified by Christian nationalism.
Sure. So I'm going to ask Dan to reflect on January 6th in a second. But when it comes to something like the life issue, we wouldn't see that. I mean, so certainly there are Bible verses that would be quoted or things like that, but we don't see that as we're imposing Christian revelation upon the American people. We would see the abortion issue as just like the segregation issue, or slavery issue, as basically a fundamental justice issue, right? Preventing the unjust killing of an innocent life. That's the way we would see it. And that's just ordinary moral reasoning to which anybody can access, right? Now, you certainly may disagree with that, but it's not that we're just imposing some foreign thing from Christian theology upon people. Okay, will you say something about January 20?
Yeah, well,
January 6th.
Yeah, let me say something about that. But first, I wanted to agree with what you're saying. People bringing their religious beliefs to the public square is an American thing. Right. And we believe everyone comes to the table with a worldview, regardless of your religion. And I like to remind people that if you want Christians to stop applying their faith to the public square, you have to go through history and get rid of a lot of people, right? You'd have to eliminate Martin Luther King Jr., whose the civil rights movement was deeply theological and deeply scriptural. He appealed to Christianity. He appealed to human dignity. He appealed to the scriptures. He rightly shamed Christians by saying, you're not living out what you say you believe, right? So if you take if you ask people of faith to not apply their faith to the public square, you're getting rid of Martin Luther King, you're getting rid of Susan B. Anthony, you're getting rid of Dorothy Day, you're getting rid of William Wilberforce, and so on and so forth. So I don't think Christians who are pro-life saying, we see humanity there. We want the laws to reflect that. Now, you may disagree with that. So January 6th, I mean, I agree with you. I think January 6th was a sort of the outworking of this sort of extreme Christian nationalism on a number of levels. I mean, one, the unwillingness to trust the system that votes president, losing an election instead of saying, okay, we lost, we'll come back next time and try to win. It's saying, I'm going to throw the system aside. We're going to take this back, which is dangerous and scary. I mean, January 6th, I think, was such a shameful day in American history. I mean, there's no way to diminish that, no other way to look at that. I would argue that it was a departure from true Christianity. Because as we said yesterday, if you have, C.S. Lewis talked about ordering your loves, and if you have your allegiances in the right proper order, you're first a Christian, then you're an American, then you're Republican or Democrat. I think you're able to say, we gave our best, we lost an election, we're going to come back next time. And we trust God that he's sovereign over all things. And so when we win or when we lose an election, we're going to be okay, right? And I think to people that stormed the Capitol, and by the way, I think many of them were not church-going faithful Christians. There were some in there. But I think it's a departure from Christianity, not an embrace of it.
And did you mention, was it Lauren Boebert? Yeah, and so one thing I would say about that is that, so if we want to pick somebody to kind of represent evangelicals on that day, I would go more toward Mike Pence. Mike Pence is, in the same sense that Dan and I are, kind of lifelong card-carrying evangelical, and I think that he did the right thing, and preserved the constitutional order through the actions that he took.
I would argue that his evangelical faith is the reason he was able to have the integrity to say no to the president. And if you read his memoir, and I'm not shilling for Mike Pence in any way, but if you read his memoir, he does talk about that, how his faith in God gave him the courage and the confidence to do the right thing. I think it's remarkable, too, the things we've mocked Mike Pence for in this country. He's too square. He's too religious. Those are the things he drew upon to do the right thing on January 6th. So maybe we do need people of faith in the public square, people of integrity on all sides.
I see a gentleman over here, right over there.
Tez John from Virginia. Who owns American Story?
Who owns what?
Who owns American Story?
I'm missing that last word.
Story.
The American Story?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. It's interesting. We happen to have a tremendous scholar here of the American founding, Mark David Hall. He is mistakenly wearing a blue ribbon, a rare mistake from the conference organizers. But so one of the things that we talk a lot about in the evangelical Christian community is we have this constant dialogue about the founders, right? The founders of the American Republic. And a lot of people are kind of obsessed with the idea that the founders are all these evangelical Christians, right? And I guess, therefore, that sort of establishes title to the United States, on behalf of the Christian faith or something like that. Now, I think the reality, Mark, you correct me if I state this incorrectly. I think the reality is they're more mixed than that. Is that fair to say? Will you accept that? Well, yeah, go ahead. That's good. Mark's a legitimate authority in this area.
So I think the mixture is oftentimes misstated. So in the late 18th century, about 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant, 2% Roman Catholics, about 1,500 Jews, and maybe 4 American cities. And so, yeah, very, very Protestant country, very Calvinist country, about 50 to 75%.
But what I was talking about with the founders is the degree to which we would recognize them as Christians like you and I go to church with. What would you say about that?
It's hard to say. I think we lack the evidence to make the strong claim that all of them were Orthodox Christians or pious people or that sort of thing. But what I usually have to combat is the argument that most of the founders or many of the founders were Enlightenment deists. And I can say with absolute certainty that the number of deists in the American founding, as we usually define deism, is maybe two, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine isn't really even an American.
What about Benjamin Franklin?
Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams are not Orthodox Christians, but they speak all the time about God intervening in the affairs of men and nations. So as we usually define deism as a clockmaker God who creates the universe and steps away from it, they're not deist.
Okay, so let me say something. So some of these are big names, right? Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, right? Maybe even George Washington. I mean, I know that Washington went to his Episcopal church, but the impression I have is that for many of them, they may have seen the Christian religion as socially useful. Is that fair, as opposed to being devout themselves?
Not as opposed to. So Jim Hudson of the Library of Congress talks about the founder's syllogism, which basically goes like this. If you want to have a Republican, small r Republican government, you must have a moral people. And if you want a moral people, you must have a religious people. And universally, they meant Christianity by religion there. Now, I think most of them actually believed it. And to the extent to which we have documents, most... I think it wasn't just using religion, it was the reality that religion is good for society, which raises a problem. As we have an increase of nuns in America, does that make democracy still possible? Now, I tend to be optimistic. You can point to non-Christian countries with flourishing democracies, places like Japan and Israel. And so I think we might say that the founders were wrong about the syllogism, but that makes the work of braver angels all the more important, right? We have to learn how to get together as Americans of all sorts of Christian denominations and non-Christian denominations and talk about hot issues like abortion in a sensible way that is accessible to all. So if I sit down and talk with my Jewish or atheist friends about abortion, for instance, I'm most certainly not going to appeal to the Bible to support my position. I'll use basic moral reasoning, as you suggested.
Yep. Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna resist the temptation to interrogate Dr. Hall some more. How about this gentleman on the aisle there? And by the way, I anticipate that we'll run out of time. I'm happy to engage anybody afterwards. Yes, sir.
My wife, Rena Bernards, is on a panel at another session, but I know when she comes out, she's going to ask me, so what is Christian nationalism? And the only thing I can gather from what you said so far that unites it is the idea of declaring the United States a Christian nation. I have two questions about that. What would that actually mean operationally other than a declaration? And secondly, how do Christian nationalists explain how that's not a violation of the first sentence in the First Amendment against the establishment of religion?
So I have characterized Christian nationalists as not necessarily being supportive of liberalism as we understand it, right? And so liberalism as we understand it would include things like the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, right? So they might say, I think, that our version of separation of church and state is not good, that we should have a civil order that forthrightly acknowledges the Lord, right, as kind of the ultimate source of authority. I guess the way to put it is they might almost think of it. I'm not trying to be provocative in saying this, but they might almost think of it the way that a Muslim country might think of Christians, right? You know, that you're tolerated, right? You know, you have certain civil rights, and but you're not following the God that is acknowledged by the state. So I think that in many, I'm not sure if they would go that far, but let me give you, here's a good phrase. So we understand that Christendom, right? Christendom is like Europe up until before the French Revolution at least, right? Christendom, right? It's generally understood that the governments are Christian governments, that the monarchs are Christian monarchs, things that the laws are Christian laws, that the churches are supported by the state, all of these things, right? I am beginning to hear in the podcasts and the writing of the Christian nationalists the phrase Christendom 2.0, right? It's very kind of evocative. So yes, so in Dan and I's mind, I would say of Christendom the same thing that I would say of the Soviet Union. In communist China, I'd say we ran the experiment, right? Ran the experiment, didn't work out. As Baptists, Dan and I would say it wasn't good for the churches, right? The most secular place in the world really is probably Western Europe, where you had established churches, right? So we don't think that that's good for the church. But there is this kind of younger generation, and certain thinkers who are yearning for that, Christendom 2.0.
Well, in some thinkers, I think Patrick Deneen and others might even say that the Second Amendment in our documents failed. So I don't know if all of them go that way, but they may not want an establishment clause. They'd prefer to start over with Christendom. I do think we need to be careful though when defining it. People who appeal to God or Christianity to make their case in the public square, I don't think we should. I think we actually are counterproductive when we just point to them and say, "Oh, Christian nationalism."
And
right?
we all do that, right? There is no view from nowhere.
Right.
There really is no neutral position. We all bring a worldview to what we attempt to do.
Read every inaugural address, even including Biden. They all appeal to God. That's not Christian nationalism. Read Lincoln. Lincoln quotes scripture. I just finished John Meacham's excellent biography of him. And Lincoln was I'm not sure if there's debate on whether he became a Christian, but he was steeped in Christianity, quoted scripture when appealing to all these things. If we point to that in the public square and we say, that's nationalism, we need to get rid of that, I think you actually empower the people who say, see, all you want is secularism, right? So
Dan is defending Christian liberalism as opposed to a Christian nationalism. Okay, so let me just take a second. I see a gentleman with a yellow here. Now, and real quick, as I say that, I also see one of my professor buddies. I'm scared to death. But let's go here first.
Cool, thanks so much. I'm highly sympathetic to your critiques of Christian nationalism, and I'm very leery of the doctrine. But could you steelman the case for Christian nationalism, not just in terms of psychological, like, here's why people are drawn to it, but here's like the case for it, essentially?
Yeah, I think that they would say that they believe that it will ultimately be better for everyone, right? So as an example, some Christians like to talk about, I'm so glad that we're getting rid of cultural Christianity, right? So glad that we're getting past that time when everybody is sort of lightly Christian and a light Christian, whether they believe it or not, everybody's doing that. They say, no, we think cultural Christianity is good for people. We think that more children will grow up with married parents who don't get divorced, and we think that there will be less abortions, and we think that they will. Just to give you an example, sociologically, okay, we know that children who grow up in an intact home will thrive relative to their peers by almost any measure, right? Whether it's how well they do with school, how likely they are to graduate from high school or college, how likely they are to go to jail, how much money they're likely to make in their lifetime, all of those things, right? And they would say, see, this is the path of human flourishing. And so if the people who are indifferent to religion kind of end up going along with this, then it will actually be a better culture and a better society. So let's just do this, right? And in the same, yes, are we a minority? They'd say, yeah, we're a minority, okay? But the Bolsheviks were too, and so in the same way that the Bolsheviks are able to kind of exert their influence and be really determined and then try to lead their society down the path that they think will be best. I think that's how they're thinking. They do believe that it will be benevolent in its effect.
Yeah, they're reacting a little bit to what's often called the acids of modernity. That dysfunctional families, all these things. Where I think we would agree with them is we would say yes, we actually lament the decline of nominalism and civic religion. I was talking with a friend of mine. I was talking with Mark Beckwith, who we were on the thing yesterday, and we were both agreeing that the decline of church attendance, the decline of civic religion is unhealthy because it bound people together, and if people aren't bound by something like that or patriotism or both, then they'll be tribal, they'll be bound by other things. So, but we think, that sort of rise in church attendance and rise in religious activity should come from the bottom up, not from the top down. We don't want the government mandating it by the sword. We want it to come, up as a Christian. We'd say that has to be a work of the Spirit.
We believe that the state will corrupt the church.
Yes.
We believe that the state's involvement will actually lead the church astray, because we think human beings are sinful. All human beings. We think that sinful human beings combined with power is a dangerous thing. And so we prefer to reduce the number of things over which sinful human beings with power are able to control. And so, we don't want to unite the church and the state for that reason.
And history gives us a pretty good sample
That's right.
size.
That's
Just
right.
say that hasn't worked out too well.
That's right. Can we go over to Dr. Jewell over there, please?
Yeah, so Dan started to speak to my question a moment ago when he talked about how the perceived radicalism on the left is what drives some Christians towards Christian nationalism. If the idea is all public expression of faith or in the public square and public spaces is seen as an establishment of religion, then a lot of Christians are going to say, well, if that's what liberalism means, that we can't, have a nativity scene on the courthouse square in December, then, forget your classical liberalism and let's try something else. So my question is, with the trend in, the Supreme Court has now been moving away from some of that 1960s style jurisprudence that started to say all that stuff is an establishment of religion. And now that we've got a move back in the other direction and some things like school choice programs that even, religious schools are allowed to participate in are now seen as passing constitutional muster. And so there's now more of a space, it seems, for expression of faith in the public square that way. Do you think that has the potential to maybe take some of the wind out of the sails of Christian nationalism if that threat no longer seems quite so imminent?
I mean, my perspective is that liberalism is in danger. And I think that people sense that on the left and the right. And I think that some people are opportunistic because of that, right? And I don't necessarily mean they're evil because they're opportunistic, but I think they're like, I sense a moment here, right? And I think that, again, I think that the whole reason that Braver Angels exists is because people who are involved in this organization at a gut level have grasped this disequilibrium in liberalism, right? They have grasped that liberalism of the American style is in danger, right? So that Dan mentioned FDR. I love to look at the Norman Rockwell paintings, The Four Freedoms, right? But I look at it nostalgically, right? I'm not sure that we as Americans possess that sense of something in common the way that people do, like in those paintings, the Four Freedoms, right? And so I think that people sensing this disunity, they're like, now is the time to kind of take hold and lead. And it's going to be a contest as to whether people like us are able to say, no, this is a good thing, right? Don't make your theoretical perfect the enemy of the practically good, right? We have a practically good thing here, that has been progressing and has been improving. and we should not abandon it. You want to say something about that, Dan?
Yeah, I can't really disagree with that. I mean, I
Good.
do think one thing we might share with the Christian nationalists is looking at the culture and saying there's some rot here, right? There's some cultural rot here. I think people on left and right would agree. What we would say is the hope for the country is cultural renewal and spiritual renewal, not something that sort of comes down from the top, if that makes sense.
Okay, how about this gentleman right here?
So, picking up on what you just said, you talked about Christian nationalism, 2.0 or Christendom 2.0.
Christendom 2.0.
Where is the Western liberalism 2.0 conversation?
That's right
happening?
here. That's what this is.
Well, and then what about the effective dialogue between that group and Christendom 2.0? Because to your point about Dan pointing to the rot or recognizing the rot, usually there are good ideas and good observations on both sides, and so how do we get to the common ground of both the understanding of the problem and then marching forward to a solution?
I mean, I think it has to be, obviously we have to be committed to renewing our key institutions, right? Our educational institutions, our churches, our civic institutions. I also think we have to resist in our politics the illiberal tendencies that both sides have, right? So on the right, there's things we have to resist. We've talked at length about them. I think on the left, there has to be resistance too. I think a lot of the statements that Trump has made, I think some of the January 6th stuff, the stolen election stuff undermines faith in democracy. There's no doubt about that. But I also think some of the statements on the left of Supreme Court decision doesn't go the way you like it, we're gonna pack the court, or this court is illegitimate. And you may disagree with the court. I mean, look, I've disagreed with the Supreme Court a lot in my life. But when we start to have politicians and people saying that this is illegitimate, we need to, those are the things that erode democracy, right? I also think we need to teach and prioritize civics, in our, in pop culture somehow, but also in education. Like, I think people take for granted that we live here and they don't understand the the sort of fragile miracle that this is in America. That what we have is not guaranteed unless we work to strengthen it.
Yeah, when we talk about things like the court is illegitimate or the election was stolen, and we never stop talking about those things, we need to realize people are hearing this. People are taking this into their souls, right? And some, they may not be as sophisticated as you are about kind of sifting some of these things. So it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous to speak that way in the first place. But second, I think that the key issue is trust. So, I mentioned Francis Fukuyama earlier. He wrote a great book about trust. Trust is a resource that a society needs in order to flourish. If we don't trust each other, then the substitute for trust is power, right? Trust will be replaced by power. That is what will happen. What I see Braver Angels is doing is trying to reassure people, yes, we are human beings of goodwill, right? We may disagree, but we don't view each other as monsters, and we actually have faith that something good might come out of our conversation with each other.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, in some ways, it's acknowledging that one thing, frustration I get with politicians on both sides is acknowledging that there's another half of the country that disagrees with you. So you're not going to get everything you want to get. I mean, I get frustrated with Congress sometimes. I mean, you go to Congress, you should fight like crazy for everything your constituency wants. But at the end of the day, understand that there's another half that disagrees with you, right? And I think this is what Better Angels is doing. We're saying, yeah, I care about conservatism. I want our candidates to win. But to understand, when it comes to our country, we're in the same boat with people who disagree with us. And do we want this thing to flourish, or do we want it to capsize,
Okay, Dan, the moral burden of choosing who gets to ask a question is beginning to get to me. So I need you to do it.
mercy. Okay, there's a young lady right here. Do you know when we're supposed to be done?
We have 5.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about your understanding and maybe how to direct people away from Christian nationalism who are borrowing a lot of symbolism from Christianity, but maybe don't attend church regularly, aren't basing their nationalism on any sort of consistent theology, but rather a belief in what it will mean for them as a person in the country?
Do you mean the people who are getting involved with it, or do you mean outside observers?
Primarily people who are getting involved in it rather than outside observers.
Okay.
I'm living this right now in Western Washington State, especially.
What does that look like for you?
So, like, there are a lot of outlying rural communities with people who previously were on the political left, who moved into the political right, who have adopted a lot of this Christian symbolism into their political advocacy and kind of adopted these socially conservative views. And I use that phraseology because, like, 5 minutes ago, they wouldn't have called themselves Christian anything. And they don't really have any connection to theology, but all of a sudden they're like, yes, we need a Christian country, because for them it's connected to this feeling of like they would have increased economic fortunes, they would have better family structure. Like, it's going to fix all of this dysfunction that they see in society that they've blamed on liberalism.
Yeah, so this is this church culture disjunction that Dan and I are talking about, right? Is that you're exactly right. What you're seeing is not necessarily connected to any theology. What it is it's more of, and I'm not trying to use the term pejoratively, but a nativist, sort of some kind of an ethnic historical appeal to who we are as Americans, right? Something like that. And that they are adopting Christianity because just that's what's there. That's the raw material, right? If they were in a different country, they might be Muslim nationalists, or whatever. It's kind of, for a lot of people, it's just relative to the culture in which they live. And so you're correct, it's not theological, right? Now, I guess my question would be, maybe you should start engaging some of these people theologically and working through some of these concepts.
Thanks. I guess I've tried to talk to them about theology. It's just tough because there's no theological basis there. And so your recommendation would essentially be invite them to church.
That's what we do, right? That's what we do. That's called the Great Commission.
Yeah. And
True. Thank you.
I would say one more thing. I think we have time for one more question. I would say one more thing about evangelicals and about people who regularly attend church tend to not steer toward this stuff. The narrative in the media about I just have to say this. The narrative in the media is that white evangelicals every Sunday is this sort of Republican hothouse, and they're passing out Ronald Reagan bobbleheads and RNC talking points in the bulletin. And the truth is, it's not. We have a few outliers. But actually, most of our churches are the opposite. They're very pietistic, and people actually aren't equipped on, how do I live out my faith in this liberal democracy? And I think if there is a weakness of evangelicals, we're not actually helping people to practice their politics well, so they're getting catechized and informed by other voices. And so, anyways, that's sort of response. Should we do one more?
One more. It's got to be pretty quick.
Okay. Right. Back there. I liked your shirt, so.
He deserves a question because at the beginning he was like, "Are you going to leave time for questions?"
That's right.
So, good, yes.
More of a framework than a question. 1776, we the people invented, right? 1865, including the enslaved, we the people 2.0. 1920, let's include women. How novel is that, right? 3.0. So you could be at 5.0 or 4.0 in the civil rights. Today, we are like 5.0. It's not about who, it's about how to be we the people. So Braver Angels is working on the right thing. How do we be, we the people, without pitchforks and torches?
Right. And so what I would say to that is that, so we have that super famous line from the Declaration of Independence, right? And what Jefferson says is, it's kind of like it's a check that can't be cashed immediately, right? But what we understand about human rights, it has been an unfolding reality throughout the history of this republic. And what I would say is that over time, we have increasingly gotten it right, I think, in important ways that should give us the faith to keep going.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about this, I just took a tour with some Christian leaders of the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., which I think everyone should do. It's so well done. One of the things that struck me was Jefferson's words, all men are created equal. He wrote words that even he couldn't contain. Like, I don't even think, there's mixed thoughts on this, but I don't even think he intended for the effect of that.
He had a bad conscience about it.
He did. But he wrote these words that even he could not contain, that, as you pointed out, continue to help America progress. So
thank you so much. You guys have been a tremendous audience. Really appreciate it.